I'm using the biography of Tolkien and Lewis to tell the story that I really want to tell, which is about myth and where do myths come from? Why do fairy tales and stories matter to us? Why do they matter to the universe? These were things that were really important to these men. And you can't understand their writings without understanding, or at least asking that question of the world and of stories. So that's the foundation.
One of my favorite reads all last year was The Mythmakers by John Hendrix. This graphic novel tells the story of the remarkable fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. It's marketed to kids, but I loved it a ton. And I really think any Lewis or Tolkien fans ages, 12 and up, are going to eat it up. I learned so much about what makes a myth and what's different between a fairy tale and a myth and a story, and learned a lot, in fact, about Lewis and Tolkien's friendship, which I thought I already knew quite a bit about. Today, I invited John Hendrix, the author and illustrator of this book, onto the show. I'm Sarah Mackenzie. This is the Read-Aloud Revival. Let's get started. So, John, you've been on the show before. You've been to Read-Aloud Revival before. I have sung the praises of so many of your books. I think The Faithful Spy, your graphic novel about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, is just brilliant. And I thought you couldn't really outdo it. So I was so delighted by The Mythmakers, which is, of course, your graphic novel about the remarkable friendship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Tell me, where did this story spring from? Like, why did you need to tell this story?
Well, I did this just for you. I knew
Oh,
you had
thank you. I
challenged
knew it.
me to do a better book than Faithful Spy. No, this book came because I am a fan of these two writers and their work, and honestly, I just owe them so much. My imaginative landscape as a child was really transformed and dominated by The Hobbit and the Narnia books, and so this has always been a real passion project that I always wanted to tell this story. It took me a while to get it onto the page, but yeah, I've been thinking about something like this for a long, long time.
Well, as I was reading, I was thinking about what a challenge it must have been to decide what to leave in and what to cut out. I know just on the very previous episode of the podcast, I interviewed Katie Ray Schoen, who's the author and illustrator of Painting Wonder, how Pauline Baynes brought the worlds of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien to life. And one of the things that Katie ran up against while she was researching that picture book biography about Pauline Baynes, the illustrator of the Narnia books, is that there was very little documented about her, written about her, very little that she could pull from, which creates a certain challenge when you're writing about someone. But I almost think the challenge might be greater with something like this, where you've got C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien. There's so much. Like, how do you even begin to decide what to read, what to research, what to look at? How do you decide when you've got enough? Did that feel like an
Oh,
insurmountable?
yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Or just a bigger problem, and I ran into this when I started doing Faithful Spy, a book about World War II. I began to think, does the world need another book about this? Like, and it's the
Okay.
same thing with Tolkien and Lewis. Like, there have been so many, hundreds of books
Yeah.
about the Inklings, about these two men, and there is always a bit of intimidation of like, am I able to add anything? Am I able to take this story and make it my own? And there's a lot of doubt that comes in any project. And then you get past that and you think, I'm going to do this. You start reading and researching, and it's just an avalanche of information. And of course, with Faithful Spy, it was primarily a single biography. I mean,
Mhm.
Hitler was sort of a co-character along with Dietrich in that story, but in this book, it is fully a like cradle to the grave story of two men with really complicated lives. So
Yeah.
it was a lot to get it in. I mean, I started the page count at 176 to match Faithful Spy, and I kept adding signatures. It was like I would add 16
Yes.
more pages, and I'd be like, okay, that's it. I'm stopping, and then it was like, okay, just one more, and I think I can get it all in.
Well, because it's not actually just a story, as if that's just the story of Cradle to Grave, Lewis and Tolkien. It's also an exploration of myth and story and how those things feed our imaginations. So tell me, like, how, because the structure of this book is so unique and so interesting. We, of course, have the story of Lewis and Tolkien being narrated by their avatars. Actually, could you give us a little overview for our listeners or viewers who haven't yet gotten their hands on the book? Like, tell us a little bit about how this is presented, because it is so unique.
Well, I'm kind of playing a trick on you. I'm using the biography of Tolkien and Lewis to really just allow myself to tell the story that I really want to tell, which is about myth and where do myths come from? Why do fairy tales and stories matter to us? Why do they matter to the universe? These were things that were really important to these men. And you can't understand their writings without understanding, or at least asking that question of the world and of stories. So that's the foundation of why this story begins the way it does, which is with these two characters that seemingly show up out of nowhere in a library, lion and wizard, just two characters chosen completely at random.
Completely
and
randomly.
and those lion and wizard are in a library. They seem to know that they are in a book, and they seem to know that they are on a quest, but
Yes.
they themselves seem to be on a kind of mythic journey that you get to follow along and enjoy their conversation alongside learning about Lewis and Tolkien, whose stories are sort of paralleling what lion and wizard are going through.
And then you've got these portals, and these are so fun. They are almost like choose your own adventure, but it's like choose to jump into the deep end if you really want to, that kind of idea. So, like, at the end of this section, I'll hold this up. There's this option, there's this door right here, which is oh so inviting, right? And it says the roots of myth. This is portal number 1, the roots of myth. Turn to page 188, or you may continue reading. So, of course, you can continue reading, but I don't know why you would, because as soon as you get to this part, you've got to go back to this portal in the back where it's like a deeper dive into something before you move on. How did you decide what to put in portals? What was that like?
Well, doors become a very important visual theme in the story,
Yeah.
as they are in Lewis and Tolkien's writing. Portal fantasy is a genre that we have from basically Lewis and Tolkien. So these were really out of necessity. My editor, these were all within the body of the story
Okay.
initially, and my editor, rightfully said, you're insane. This is way too much information to have in this one story. And I kept telling him, no, you have to know where myth comes from to get the later parts of the story. And so he was telling me to cut it, and this is what a good editor does. They really challenge the things that are most precious to you. So after crying myself to sleep a few nights, I remembered my choose your own adventure past and thought, you know what, doors are so central. What if we just basically allow this to be an end note that you can experience with the story or later? And in fact, with younger readers, I tell them, you know what, skip the portals the first time through and just
Okay.
get the story. Older readers, if you want to take that detour, you can. But I found if you're 10 to 13 and you just feel like, I just want to keep on trucking with this story,
Yeah.
I wrote it so that you can just, keep on going.
For those of our viewers and listeners who are like, wait, myth, story isn't the same thing, fairy tale. You'll have to read the book to untangle it all and see where they all came from and what they all do that's different. But do you have like a way you like to talk about the differences of those
Yeah.
kinds of, yeah.
It's actually really interesting, and what I'm doing in this book is like probably real scholars would want to throw the book out the window. I mean, I am overly generalizing and making things very sort of legible
Mm-hmm.
for readers. And so to do that, I really have to sort of streamline some of these big ideas. And one of the most basic ones is that when we say myth, our modern minds hear lie or
Yeah.
something that is false, right? So if
Yeah.
I said the story of Genesis is a myth,
Mm-hmm.
you might be tempted to think, oh, I think that is a false story, right?
Mm-hmm. Or you're
And
devaluing it.
that's right. And
Yeah.
it's more like saying all facts contain truth, but not all truth contains facts. And one simple way you can think of that is just like poetry, right? When you are writing poetry, you are speaking about truth, but it is not a documentary, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so there are these stories in our past as human beings that always, to the reader, told them something true about the world.
Yeah.
And that's what myths and later epics and legends and folk tales and fairy tales all sort of orbit this idea. And I think to understand their stories and to understand a lot of the literature we read in the world,
Mhm.
that's an important context.
And it actually then helps us realize that then, contrary to our very modernized idea of the word myth as being a lie, where we might feel like the story is actually being devalued, actually a myth then gets valued above like a factual description of exactly like a scientific, let's say, description of exactly what
Hmm.
happened. Because there's so, like you said, there's so much more truth being communicated on so many different
Well,
levels.
then this is what Tolkien basically convinced Lewis of when he was an atheist, was that myth and fairy tales are the highest form of human art because they say things about the human condition that can be said in no other way. They express things that are totally singular to themselves, and that's why they have value. Because Lewis was challenging Tolkien at the time and saying, as men of truth, as scholars, we should reject lies. And though the stories are pleasant, and they are still lies, though breathed through silver. That was his famous line. And Tolkien rebutted that immediately and said, no, 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 you don't understand. This is like God's secret elvish. This is a way that we tell things to one another that can be said in no other form. And therefore, it has this primacy.
Yeah.
And stories, that's why stories matter to us.
So then I guess through this entire graphic novel, it felt to me as a reader like you were helping me understand that importance and that like primal need for story while you're unraveling the story of Lewis and Tolkien, Lewis's conversion, their friendship, the sorrows of their friendship later in life. What do you think is the most misunderstood thing about their friendship
Well,
that
I
you guys?
think let me frame it this way. They created or subcreated, as Tolkien would say, these two worlds that we understand very well, Narnia and Middle Earth, and they've been illustrated a gazillion times.
Mhm.
They also subcreated this third fantasy world together, which I think is just as almost implausible as their other two worlds, and that is the world of the Inklings. Their own friendship is a bit of a fantasy world that we project a lot of our hopes and desires and longings. Who doesn't want to go to the pub on a snowy afternoon and have a fire and a cider and read poems together and talk about the great things with your friends? I mean, I am an academic. I am a professor at WashU, and I only do that, 6 or 7 times a week. No, I never do that, right?
Right.
So, there is a kind of fantasy or a myth
Mhm.
to their own friendship, and I actually love that about their story. It's why I wanted to do the book. I wanted to illustrate that myth, but
Mm.
also I wanted to really ground it in some of the hard truths that came out about their friendship too. Tolkien famously hated Narnia, and
Yeah.
actually one of the things I always tell people in the context of that is that Tolkien basically hated everything.
Yeah.
Like he it's not special that he hated Narnia. He was very, very dismissive of other forms of art. And it's just he was a persnickety, Englishman. So again, those are some things that people think about when they think about the Inklings.
Yeah, that actually was helpful for me because I had heard that Tolkien really didn't like Narnia, and it always very much bothered me, and it still does kind of. But I have a little, I have a little more sympathy for Tolkien's view, getting to know him and his personality type, and realizing like, oh, this was his default to
Oh yeah.
anything was
And the
yes.
the 2 of them are very much like the odd couple, and so you get that in the avatars of Lion and Wizard, and
Yeah,
even the way their forms are kinda short and round, tall and skinny. One
yeah.
is a mumbly sort of equivocator, the other one is sort of brash, making these bold predictions, always late, and that's what was fun about Lion and Wizard in this story, in that I really wanted you to feel like you were spending time with, Professor Tolkien and Lewis, but also I did not want to do fan fiction. I did not want to anytime we literally see Lewis and Tolkien together in the book, that is a source conversation that has documentation to back it up. But Lion and Wizard kind of allow me this ability to go on adventures and to have the characters do things that are just a little more exciting than sitting in the pub talking, which is basically what Tolkien and Lewis did their whole life.
Yeah, you didn't want to make a graphic novel of just that
That
over
you
and over and
can't
over
do
again.
225 pages of that. Yeah.
I mean, somebody probably could, but
Actually, no,
yours
you're
is
right. You
far more
could.
exciting. Yeah.
I would read that. Yes.
Tell me about the color palette, because there is a very specific color palette, and we'll put a few of these interior spreads on the screen so viewers can see this. And if you're listening to this on the podcast, you can go to the show notes at readaloudrevival.com/261 to see some of these. But there's a very specific, limited color palette going on here.
Mm-hmm. Well, just like Faithful Spy, I chose a very limited set of colors, and it took me a while to get to this place. Like all work, it looks like when you read a book, it was just this stroke of genius, and everything fell into place immediately. And I'm here to tell you, making books is a mess, like beginning to end. It's just a total train wreck. But the colors were actually very interesting in this book because I wanted to have the same limited palette like Faithful Spy. But there's also a trick that happens in the book where the colors all dim slightly as the book goes on throughout the story. And so it is printed in CMYK. It is not a Pantone color book, but
Oh, okay.
it looks like it. And I wanted just that effect of everything sort of graying out as you get to the end. And
John,
then
I didn't notice this. What the heck? That's amazing. I can see it now so clearly.
Yeah. Actually, I kind of think I maybe should have made it a little more overt, but
I don't
and
know.
then there is a kind of fifth color that comes in. There's a sequence at the end that's a little fantastical, and that sequence has a color that has never appeared anywhere in the book. So these kind of Easter colors that come into the story, purple, plum, and gold, that was where that color palette first came from conceptually.
Oh, that is so cool. Yes, I can see it.
No,
I'm
it
looking
is
at
one
that
of those
final
things where
spread.
you dream that up. You're like, ooh, what if all the colors just dimmed a little bit? And then you're like, okay, how am I going to make that happen? And we
Yeah.
talked about tinting Pantones down, and yeah, but in the final version, it's a nice effect.
Well, and I actually really appreciate things like that I wouldn't get on my first or second read through. That would be like, maybe I would have noticed it on a third. Maybe, but now I'm noticing it because you pointed it out to me. But these are the kind of things that make you go like, okay, now I'm going to read the whole thing again, keeping an eye on that.
Yeah.
Love it. Did you have a favorite like scene or section?
Oh man, yeah. I mean, there's several that I just really enjoyed drawing. I mean, the dragon ride, Lion and Wizard go on a dragon ride to help explain one of the coolest things that Tolkien has ever written, actually, which is this essay called On Fairy Stories, which no 12 or 13-year-old would ever read, but like the ideas in it are so good. And like my core audience is like a kid who has been assigned Beowulf or the Odyssey, and they like cannot get through it, and they're like, why is this valuable? And this essay shines a lot of light on what fantasy does to us and why we read it and why it's valuable. And so I came up with this dragon ride as a way to sort of visualize some of these more abstract ideas. And I love that sequence in the book.
My oldest daughter is in graduate school in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews. And
jealous.
She is getting a master's degree in theology and the arts and is writing her thesis on imagination and faith. I'm messing this up. She's going to correct me later. But she's drawing heavily on fairy stories by Tolkien. And she's not yet read The Mythmakers. I can't wait to put it in her hands. So.
Oh, yeah. No, I hope I get cited. That's my goal.
Oh, yes. Fabulous. Let's see. What was the hardest part? What was the hardest part of creating this one? I mean, you've created so many different books before, and they're all so complex that I wonder if you like tell yourself every time, like next time I'll do something easier. And
every time, or I say I'm never doing that again, or some version of that. And this one was truly like a 10,000 piece puzzle where I did not have a picture of what was on the box, so it just truly felt like I had, like with a lot of my books, I have a way that I want it to feel when you are reading it, or I have a sense about the idea that you're going to take away. Mm-hmm. That's very clear, but then getting it into a form where it accomplishes that goal is extremely abstract. So, with this one, it just took so long. I spent 18 months, 2 years just writing and researching. And when I got to the finish line of just having written the thing and really loving the story, it was like, oh, wait, now I have to draw the whole thing? Like,
in panels, no less.
I have never gotten to the point on a project where I was like, I need a studio. Like, I need Studio Ghibli. I need like the Disney studios to help me with this
Hmm.
because I am just worn out.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
every book has that sort of hurdle, and once you push through it, then you're usually on the downslope.
I'm so curious about what I mean. I don't know if you can even describe this. What your manuscript would have looked like for this, because I'm looking at the panels and then there are narrations in between and the portals.
Yeah, it's a good question. I get it a lot. Like, oh, do you write first and then draw?
Yeah.
And I always quote Bob Dylan, who was once asked, "Do you write the words or the music first?" And he said, "Yes." And basically, that is I just like equating myself with Bob Dylan. And that is the way I write. Is like I write a little bit and then I draw and I put those into the manuscript and I think about the page design because unlike a lot of publishing relationships, Abram really, really trusts me where I get to design the InDesign file. I own the design template. They
Oh
give
wow.
me a lot of freedom to typeset these books. And, I studied design in college, so I feel like I have some chops there.
Hmm.
But without the freedom to be able to reflow stuff, redesign the type, it would be really tedious. So it is a back and forth process that, again, is a total train wreck until
I
you get to.
wondered about the design because as I was maybe 10, 20 pages into it the first time, I flipped, book nerd that I am, to who designed this? This is so
Yeah.
complicated. And then when it said book design and typesetting by John Hendrix, I was like, is there anything this man cannot do?
I
That
get
is the question.
honestly, it's probably the easiest way to do these kind of books because again, you
Yeah.
pull out one like when my editor comes back to me like we got to cut this section, then it like, reflows everything through the story. So like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's it's just a game of Tetris that's really frustrating during the season of designing the actual page layouts.
So as you're doing research and there's so many elements of Jack and Toller's young lives, of their friendship. I mean, as an author, I always feel like the hardest thing is not picking out what's going to go in, but like what to leave on the cutting room
Mhm.
floor.
Yep.
Did you have like a central question or something that was guiding you as you decided what was going to go in this book?
Yeah, I mean, there's really significant things I left out. I mean, Lewis's favorite book he ever wrote was Till We Have Faces, and he wrote it with his wife Joy. And I don't talk about that book at all, which
Yeah.
is crazy. But again, the things that I decided to make important were all centered around like our work gets better in community, or like what fellowship gives to artists. So like their story and the way that they wrote is like pointing at each other. They gave each other a gift that no one else could have given them that allowed them to complete their journey. A lot I've been saying it's a lot like Galadriel gives the fellowship this like gift that they don't understand when they get it, but it's going to be really important later.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the magic sauce between them. And so anything that orbited both, why myth, why fairy tales, and why friendship. And those things together were kind of the stew that I was looking to create.
Yeah, right before you said the word stew, I was like, "Oh yes, like a soup." That's so great.
I always
Um,
use stew when I talk about my work because it is the act of just chopping up random things and throwing it into a boiling pot that
yeah.
that that vibes with me. Yeah.
Well, it makes sense. I know you're friends with Jonathan Auxier. I just finished reading, I think for the seventh or eighth time, Sweep, the story of a girl and her monster. It's one of my all-time
Fabulous.
favorites.
It should
But
have won it should have won every sticker imaginable, and I tell people that all the time.
I
It's a
100%
masterpiece.
agree.
Yeah.
It's a masterpiece. Every time I read it, I am gobsmacked by how good it is. I mean, it is so good.
Yeah.
It is so moving. It is funny. It is heart wrenching. I sob. I laugh. Anyway, I just read it aloud for the first time to my 13 and 11-year-old twins. And at the very end, of course, he has in the author's note story soup, and he talks about all the different ingredients that kind of
Oh,
got
yeah.
concocted in this pot. So just knowing that you're friends and and you've, I mean, it feels to me like we all, anybody who's doing creative work has this longing for what the Inklings had, for what
Yeah.
Tolkien and
Oh,
Lewis
yeah.
had in each other.
Yeah, I mean, and I run a graduate program in illustration, a MFA IVC program at WashU in St. Louis,
Hmm.
and basically, I'm trying to recreate the Inklings. I'm making a little tree house where people can come and work together and have real community, to be in each other's creative lives, to encourage one another, because that is basically how we grow. I think the cultural liturgy of artists as primarily loners or like works of genius being solo efforts. I just think that's really overstated. So
Mm.
I heard about some of my students getting together over their spring break last year and like getting a cabin and doing a writing retreat, and I was just like I was really touched by that. I was like, they have found a creative community together. I love that.
We can actually even see that in Lewis, at least in his young life. I don't remember. I'm gonna have to remember what Toller's young life was like. I don't remember
Well,
it off the top of my head. I guess I've.
Tolkien had all of these clubs. Like he was obsessed with clubs, like going back to
Okay.
when he was a kid. And then he got Jack involved with the coal biters, which were these men that would read Norse mythology and Icelandic together, and then later the Inklings. Like they it was kind of a thing at the time too. It was just like little clubs were really fun.
Hmm.
And that became just a through line in Tolkien's life, partially because I think he was an orphan. He was always looking for community and for family.
Yeah.
And that found family and friends, especially after the war, was
Hmm.
really important to him.
Well, and then Jack and his brother in their young childhood had that whole fantasy world that was called something I can't remember now off the top of my
Loxon,
head.
yeah, or
Yes.
Animal Land, both of them, yeah.
Yes. When I found that out for the first time, I remember thinking, oh, that makes so much sense. And I think as parents, watching our children do sort of this story soup making in childhood.
Lewis's first impression of beauty was from his brother, who brought in, very famously in his autobiography, he talks about his brother bringing in a little biscuit tin that he had put some grass and moss and pine cones and sticks and leaves and made this little Garden of Eden that he had brought into the house for Jack to play with.
Yeah.
And that was a touchstone memory for him of sort of the idea of being able to create your own world and then enjoy it and take it inside and make it your own. And that memory of beauty basically birthed all of his creative works, if you could really sum it up in a singular moment.
I read somewhere, I don't know if this is true. You would probably know if this was true. That Lewis said about Narnia that he like basically made a story with all the things that he loved in it. Kind of like a story soup, I guess, or a story stew, like we're saying.
Well, that is why Tolkien hated it. I mean, yes, it was
Father Christmas
absolutely.
and
Oh,
mythology.
yeah, he could not believe what Lewis was doing. Yes, there is some truth to that. He always thought of it as a supposal, as opposed to an allegory. But for those of your listeners that are interested in this, there's an amazing book called Planet Narnia, which I
Uh-huh.
read, which is this theory by Michael Ward, who is a professor at Oxford, who kind of refutes the idea that the Narnia books were kind of slapdash and just thrown together. And his theory was that each book in the Narnia series reflects one of the seven medieval heavenly bodies, which Lewis was obsessed with medieval cosmology. And so, like Jupiter, Mars, the moon, the sun, and he takes the sort of classic ideas associated with each of those planets and applies them to each book. And it sounds
What?
insane, but the
Yeah.
more you read it, you're like, I mean, I was fully convinced by the end of it. And honestly, it's a very Lewisinian thing to do. And so it really is amazing.
Can we go back to what you said? You said Lewis thought of Narnia as a supposal rather than an allegory. Tell me more about
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, he would always say that like he never set out to like convert anyone. He had these images in his head of a fawn under a lamppost in the snow in the woods, like with a package. Like, what's this story? And so when finally Aslan, like he described it as Aslan, like leapt into the story, and he always imagined like, what if we took the basic mythology of the Christian story and suppose that mythology was placed in a different world, suppose that was like reframed with a different set of criteria and characters and laws about the universe, what would that look and feel like?
Mm.
And so that's what Narnia was to him. And actually, you could say that the space trilogy is also a kind of supposal as well. I mean, there's a real through line between the space trilogy and Narnia as the kind of themes he was exploring.
So that's interesting because it feels to me like then a supposal feels like it's almost like opening up. Like here, let's take this mythology, put it in another land, and see where it takes us, which kind of opens up the ideas. Whereas an allegory, if we're thinking like Pilgrim's Progress or something, it almost feels like if you take a funnel, like the opened up funnel, and we
Mhm.
turn it upside down because you're taking all these big ideas and consolidating it into like this means this, and this means that, and this means
It's basically like a one-to-one in an allegory.
yeah,
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 and I mean, Tolkien famously said he hated allegory,
yeah.
and criticized Narnia for some of those reasons. But of course, if you've ever read the Silmarillion, he basically did for the Old Testament what Lewis did for the New Testament in the Narnia books. I mean, the Silmarillion
Hmm.
is Genesis. The first half of it is just Genesis reskinned in Middle Earth language. And
Oh,
so
interesting.
they both were and I mean, if I can say something about which writer was more obsessed with gospel themes, it was Tolkien by far. Like you
Okay.
could go through Lord of the Rings and I did this the other day because I was on a podcast where we were talking about this, and I came up with 9 very clear themes in the books that are just like head and shoulders over like Aslan at the Stone Table, which
Yeah.
after you get past that book, it's actually much more of just a fantasy series outside of the
Hmm.
last battle.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
there's
nobody accuses, but the Voyage of the Dawn Treader as being an allegory. It's just The
right,
Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, they were actually very much doing the same project together their whole lives. And it's of course something we can only see now looking backwards on it. But again, to that end is why I gave the book a sort of fantastical ending.
Talk to me about I don't know what the word is, I was going to say dismantling. That feels like maybe a more violent word than I'm looking for, but
Mm,
of their friendship. I felt it even as I was reading in the middle of like when they're at the eagle and child, and they're having these beautiful conversations, and they're like pointing at each other's work, like you said, and there's like this creative synergy happening, and I know it's gonna fall apart, and so I'm like grieving it before it even comes because I know it's coming. Talk to
mm.
me about what happened between them.
Yeah, I had somebody write me an email that said, I'm halfway through the book and I'm devastated because I think they're not going to be friends by the end. And I don't think I could finish the book. And I said, I want you to trust me. I want you to finish the book. It's going to be okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, if speaking just of my own theological point of view, this world is not our home.
Mm-hmm.
And, for me, reflecting the reality of their friendship is in some way honoring the sort of condition of what life is here. And
Mm.
sometimes things are really, really hard, and there is not a resolution that we long for. And I would say that they shared some of the most. They were not just friends; they were really bros, basically, for 25 years. And then, like a lot of friendships, there was a kind of dimming, there was a sadness, there was a kind of breakage that happened with some things that had to do with Lewis's marriage and Tolkien's Catholic beliefs. And they never were openly hostile. They would get a beer together in the company of the Inklings and friends throughout their lives, but that close fellowship that they had was never really repaired after his marriage to Joy.
Yeah.
And there is a kind of tragic loss to it because, I mean, on one hand, they had this incredible hothouse friendship for 25, 30 years. I mean, the Inklings alone met for a huge period of time from the 40s, from the late 30s to the late 40s. And that's crazy to have a reading group that lasts that long and produces so much good work.
Mm-hmm.
But there is sort of inevitable loss that comes in this world, and I just didn't wanna shy away from that in telling their story.
Which also tells a deeper truth about, like you said, this world is not our home, and this story not being at the
Yeah.
end here. So I
I mean,
knew, similar to the reader who wrote into you, I knew it was coming. Of course, I was like, oh, but how are you gonna like put my
well,
heart back
let me
together at the
let
end?
me tell you this, all myths I wrote this story as a myth.
Yeah.
All myths, as Tolkien told us in On Fairy Stories, have
Mm-hmm.
what he believed to be the anti-catastrophe, or he called it the eucatastrophe, based on the same root word as Eucharist, or thankfulness. And so eucatastrophe is like the opposite catastrophe, and almost any good story has it. And Tolkien believed that the text for the eucatastrophe is the biblical resurrection. So the way this thing works is you have the maximum amount of loss and pain with no hope of it ever being saved, and then immediately followed by maximum joy, sort of a reversal of the loss. And so I'll just say that I could not tell a myth without a true eucatastrophe in it.
Yeah,
So and again, I had a little fun with the ending. I sweated over it. I
I bet you
really
did.
tried to make it worth the story itself and echo some of the things that I think Tolkien and Lewis believed themselves
Yeah.
about the world. And so that was a challenge, but I'm happy with how it came out.
I think you met your goals there. It's very
I
satisfying.
like how
Very, very
mysterious we're
satisfying.
being. It's very fun.
I know. Everybody's gonna have to get the book at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a cruel question, but as we wrap up, you knew I was gonna ask it, I'm sure. 2 questions. I want to know who you're more like, Lewis or Tolkien.
Okay, I sort of categorize them. This is easy for me. I categorize them to help us understand their creative process in the book as sort of mythos versus logos, the sort of love of the word and fact, and then the love of the gesture and the story.
Hmm.
And in some ways, you could call that a person, an analytical person, a logos person, or an intuitive person, a mythos person. And I'm much too intuitive by far. I write very intuitively. I think in big, broad shapes. I often struggle with detail. I mean, books like this are really challenging in the final pass where I need to go through and make sure everything I'm saying is accurate. There's probably 10,000 individual facts in this book, and that really strains the way that I think about my own creative process. But, we have wonderful people at Abrams, my editor, copy editors, fact checkers. So, yeah, we try to get most of them. Okay, so if I'm stranded on a desert island and I have one series to take with me, Lord of the Rings or Narnia, oh man, so I've said I want the passage from Dawn Treader where Reepicheep goes over the wave, basically to Aslan's country. I want that at my funeral. I cannot read it without crying. And yet, I also would say the same thing of when Sam and Frodo are on the sort of shoulders of Mount Doom, and they see through the clouds Arendelle, the star of creation. I that passage gets me every time. I mean, I would probably just pick Lord of the Rings just for the sheer word count, just to have more things to read. But yeah, it'd be pretty close. I mean, there's actually something that happens every year about October, like the first crisp day, I'm like, "Ooh, it's Fellowship of the Ring time." And, it just feels like something about the season makes me wanna read those books.
John, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was great.
I do wanna mention this is actually the other cruel thing that people do when they have you on. You talk about a project that, you spent 5 years on, and then they're like, "What's next? What's your next project?" And I'm
What have
always
you
like,
done for us lately?
"Can we just read this book for the next 3 years?" No, so I am working on my next long form graphic novel is going to be about the Salem witch trials. And I'm really interested in telling this story for a kind of broad audience. Most people who know that story, or they think they know that story, from The Crucible or maybe Scarlet Letter or something. But I'm really excited about trying to tell maybe a scary story, and it's way weirder than you think. It's just a strange event. We'll never know fully what happened,
Hmm.
and I can't wait to sort of unpack it for young audiences soon.
Where are you at in your own process of it?
Oh, well, I mean, initially, it takes forever to read. So I'm reading and sketching out story drafts. And what I'll do is I'll write like little snippets of things when it comes to me, and then I sort of rearrange them in a document together. And yeah, so look for this in 10 to 15 years, I guess. I don't know. Uh,
Show notes for this episode are at readaloudrevival.com/261. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. In the meantime, go make meaningful and lasting connections with your kids through books.